There are names that belong to history, and there are names that seem to stand outside it. Hermes Trismegistus is one of them, half sage, half symbol, half doorway into a universe where the visible world is only the outer skin of a hidden order. But what if the hidden wisdom of Hermes was never meant to give power over the world, but to teach the soul how to recognize the divine pattern already moving through it? This archive is not an introduction to the occult. It is not a map of forbidden spells or a guide to secret power. What we are opening today is something older and quieter than that, a body of thought that asks the soul to turn inward and recognize something it may have forgotten long before it was born. The Hermetic tradition speaks of divine mind, of correspondence between heaven and earth, of the soul's slow ascent toward the light it came from. And that is the promise we carry into this investigation. But there is a wound beneath this search. Most people who come to ancient wisdom come hungry for something the modern world has failed to provide. They want meaning. They want revelation. They want a secret that will finally explain the distance they feel between themselves and everything sacred. And in that hunger, they sometimes reach for the idea of hidden knowledge, as though knowledge alone could save them. What Hermes asks is something harder. Not that you collect wisdom, but that you become it. We begin in the ancient world, somewhere between the temples of Egypt and the academies of Greece, in the long golden shadow of Alexandria, where civilizations did not simply meet, but dissolved into one another. It is here, in this extraordinary city where scribes and philosophers shared the same streets, where Egyptian priests and Greek thinkers looked at one another across centuries of different seeing, that a figure began to take shape. Not quite a man, not quite a god, a threshold, a bridge, the one the ancients called thrice greatest, and the tradition they attributed to him reached across the known world like a quiet flame carried from hand to hand through the dark. To understand Hermes Trismegistus, you must first understand the age that created the conditions for such a figure to exist. By the time Alexandria rose to prominence in the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era, the ancient world was undergoing a kind of spiritual earthquake. Egypt had lived for thousands of years under the weight of its own monumental religion, a tradition of gods, afterlife, cosmic order, and sacred kingship so vast that it seemed eternal. But now Greek thought had arrived, bringing with it questions that Egyptian myth had never quite needed to ask out loud. What is the soul? What is the divine mind? Is the cosmos rational? Does the structure of the universe contain a secret principle that the human mind can access? Roman power held the political world together with law and force, but it could not answer those questions. And so, across the ancient Mediterranean, spiritual hunger grew in proportion to imperial stability. Mystery schools multiplied. New religious movements spread. People sought initiation, purification, gnosis, and inner transformation with an urgency that official religion could not always satisfy. The old gods still stood in their temples, but something in the human heart was reaching past the statues toward a deeper, less visible presence. This was the age that needed a teaching like the Hermetic one, an age standing at a crossroads between many worlds, searching for a map that could hold all of them together. The meeting of Egyptian religious genius and Greek philosophical inquiry did not simply produce a compromise. In certain texts, certain traditions and certain figures, it produced something new, a synthesis that preserved the sacred depth of Egyptian cosmology while clothing it in the conceptual language of Greek reason. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus emerged from precisely this fusion. The Greeks had long identified their god Hermes, the messenger, the guide of souls, the keeper of thresholds, with the Egyptian god Thoth, the divine scribe, the lord of wisdom, the measurer of cosmic time. When these two figures merged in the imagination of the ancient world, something unusual became possible. A figure who was human enough to speak to mortals and divine enough to carry the language of the gods. Beneath all the historical complexity, there was a simpler longing. People wanted to know where they came from. They wanted to understand what connected the stars above to the breath in their chest, what connected the movements of the heavens to the stirrings of the soul, what connected the visible world of matter and change to whatever silent, eternal principle seemed to lie beneath it. They wanted a map of reality, one that could hold together God and cosmos, mind and matter, soul and body, time and eternity. No single philosophy had quite managed to give them that, and no official religion had quite closed the gap between the human and the divine without leaving behind a sense of residual distance and longing. What Hermetic thought offered was the possibility that the gap was not as wide as it appeared, that the human being was not a stranger in the cosmos, but a reflection of it, that the soul carried within itself something that corresponded to the divine order above, just as a clear pool of water carries within itself the image of the sky. This was not a comfortable idea for those who needed the divine to remain absolutely separate from the human. But for seekers who felt the distance between themselves and the sacred as a kind of wound, the Hermetic teaching offered something close to a homecoming. The most important thing to understand about Hermes Trismegistus is that the historical question of who he was has never been fully resolved and perhaps never will be. Early Christian writers like Lactantius and Augustine spoke of him as a real Egyptian sage, a prophet of extraordinary antiquity, whose wisdom prefigured Christian revelation. Renaissance thinkers like Marsilio Ficino believed he was an actual ancient philosopher, one of the first wise men in human history. Later scholarship revealed that the texts attributed to him were composed much later than legend claimed, probably between the 1st and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, drawing on a rich mixture of Platonism, Egyptian religious thought, Stoicism, and early Jewish and Christian ideas. But this historical discovery did not diminish the tradition. It transformed it, because it became clear that Hermes Trismegistus was never simply a historical person in the ordinary sense. He was something rarer and stranger than that. He was an archetype, a symbolic figure through whom an entire civilization processed its deepest questions about the soul, the cosmos, and the divine mind. The name itself, thrice greatest, points beyond individual biography toward something that transcends any single life. He became a mirror in which seekers across many centuries could see reflected their own longing for hidden wisdom, for the key that would open the architecture beneath the visible world. The primary surviving body of Hermetic wisdom is known as the Corpus Hermeticum, a collection of philosophical and spiritual dialogues discovered, preserved, translated, and transmitted across more than 1,000 years of human history. These texts are not simple. They do not speak the way a modern textbook speaks. They speak the way a mystery speaks, in layers, in questions nested inside revelations, in images that point beyond themselves toward something that language can approach, but never fully contain. The dialogues are often structured as encounters between a seeker and a divine teacher, between a student and nous, the divine mind, between the human soul and a voice that seems to come from the source of all things. One of the most famous and foundational texts in this collection is known as the Poemandres, which can be understood as the shepherd of men. In this text, a seeker receives a vision in which a vast being of light appears to him and begins to reveal the nature of creation, the origin of the soul, and the path of return toward the divine. The language is mythological, but the intention is philosophical and spiritual. This is not a story about gods fighting. It is an attempt to describe, in the only language available to it, the process by which the infinite divine mind poured itself into form, and how the human soul, bearing a spark of that original light, descended into matter and now moves toward its return. The Hermetic tradition extended far beyond the Corpus Hermeticum alone. Other texts, including the Emerald Tablet, a short but extraordinarily dense document that later became central to the alchemical tradition, carried Hermetic ideas across centuries in condensed and symbolic form. The famous phrase, most often translated as "that which is above is like that which is below, and that which is below is like that which is above," comes from this tradition. It is a statement that, on the surface, sounds almost simple, but it contains, for those who sit with it long enough, a complete cosmology, a complete spiritual map, and an invitation to understand the soul as a living reflection of the divine order. The first great revelation of Hermetic thought is this: you are not separate from the cosmos. You are a miniature version of it. Every structure that exists in the universe, from the movements of the stars to the rhythm of the seasons, from the order of the elements to the hierarchy of divine mind, has its correspondence within the human being. This is not metaphor used for decoration. For the ancient Hermetic thinkers, this was literal and precise. The human soul contains within itself every principle that the cosmos expresses externally. This means that the journey inward and the journey outward are, in a profound sense, the same journey. This teaching reversed the ordinary assumption about where to look for divine truth. Most religious systems of the ancient world directed the seeker outward, toward temples, toward priests, toward sacred cities, and holy mountains. The Hermetic tradition did not abolish those outward forms, but it added something that felt revolutionary. It said that the most sacred archive was already inside the seeker, that the divine mind, which the Hermetic texts called the nous, was not distant. It was the deepest layer of what you already were. The outer world was a map, but the map and the territory were, beneath everything, the same. What separated Hermetic teaching from ordinary ancient philosophy was not only its content, but its intention. Greek philosophy, broadly speaking, sought understanding. It wanted to know what things were, how they worked, what principles governed existence. Even the most spiritual branches of Greek thought, like Platonism and Neoplatonism, retained something that resembled an academic posture. The Hermetic tradition went further. It did not merely want the seeker to understand the cosmos. It wanted the seeker to be transformed by that understanding, The difference is enormous. Knowledge that leaves the soul untouched is, in the Hermetic view, not really knowledge at all. It is only the surface of knowledge. The Hermetic texts consistently speak of a process of purification, of the gradual shedding of ignorance, passion, and attachment to the purely material world, and of a corresponding ascent toward the divine mind. This is not an intellectual exercise. It is a way of life, a turning of the entire person toward the light that the tradition claimed was the soul's original home. In this sense, Hermes Trismegistus was not simply a philosopher. He was, in the imagination of the ancient world, a guide of souls, a figure who knew the path through the invisible architecture of reality, and who offered that knowledge not to satisfy curiosity, but to initiate a genuine transformation. Ideas as ambitious as these rarely remain undisturbed, and the Hermetic tradition, for all its quiet contemplative tone, carried within itself ideas that made certain authorities deeply uncomfortable. The suggestion that the divine mind was accessible directly to the human soul without the necessary mediation of priest, temple, or institutional doctrine was not a neutral claim in the ancient world. It did not require much imagination to see how such an idea could challenge the structures through which religious and political power organized itself. If the divine is already within you, what is the precise role of the hierarchy that claims to stand between you and the sacred? This tension became especially sharp as Christianity consolidated its institutional form across the Roman Empire during the 3rd and 4th centuries. Some early Christian writers had spoken of Hermes Trismegistus with admiration, seeing him as a pagan witness to divine truth. But as Christian orthodoxy hardened, the boundary between acceptable wisdom and dangerous speculation grew increasingly strict. Hermetic texts lived in a complicated middle space, drawing on ideas that were neither fully pagan nor fully Christian, suggesting a divine accessibility that did not require institutional mediation, and mixing philosophical thought with what many authorities would classify as magic. These were not comfortable features in an age when the definition of correct belief was being fought over with enormous intensity. Beyond the specifically Christian context, Hermetic thought created friction wherever it encountered systems of power that depended on exclusive access to divine truth. In its deepest form, the Hermetic teaching was deeply egalitarian in a spiritual sense. It claimed that every human soul carried within it the capacity for awakening, for correspondence with the divine, for ascent toward the source. This was a radical idea, not because it was politically radical in the modern sense, but because it placed the sacred archive inside each person rather than inside the institution. Empires, churches, and sacred hierarchies have always been nervous about teachings that relocate the authority of the divine from the visible institution to the invisible soul. The danger that Hermetic thought represented was not primarily the danger of revolution. It was the danger of inwardness. A soul that learns to perceive itself as a participant in divine reality is a soul that becomes harder to govern through fear. It develops an interior reference point, a sense of something within itself that is older, quieter, and more real than any external authority. This is precisely what the Hermetic tradition pointed toward. The awakened soul in this teaching does not need to be shown the divine from the outside. It learns to recognize the divine pattern already moving through its own experience. For institutions whose authority depended on presenting themselves as the only legitimate gateway to the sacred, this teaching felt like a quiet undermining of the foundations. It did not attack doctrine openly, it simply went beneath it, beneath the surface of any particular creed or ritual, to a layer of spiritual reality that the tradition claimed was older than all of them. In this sense, the Hermetic teaching was dangerous not because it was violent or subversive in any ordinary way, but because it was so profoundly interior. It offered seekers a kind of freedom that no external power could quite reach. The freedom of a soul that has recognized its own divine origin. Before we go deeper, I want to ask you something. When you encounter ancient wisdom like this, do you find yourself looking for a secret that will give you power or clarity over the outer world? Or do you find yourself hoping for a mirror, something that will show you the shape of what is already moving inside you? Share what you find in the comments, because I believe that question itself might be the oldest door in the archive. 4.4. The Descent Beneath the Surface. We have traced the legend, the historical context, and the friction. Now it is time to descend beneath the surface of Hermetic history and enter the teaching itself. Because the real archive is not the controversy. It is not the question of whether Hermes was a real man or a symbolic figure. The real archive is the body of ideas that survived, that traveled across centuries wrapped in manuscript and metaphor, and that still speaks to something in the human soul that the modern world has not managed to quiet. Let us open it. At the center of Hermetic thought stands a single extraordinary concept: the divine mind, which the texts call the nous, is the source and substance of all reality. It is not a God who lives somewhere above the world and occasionally intervenes in it. It is the living intelligence that pervades and generates the cosmos from within. Everything that exists, from the highest spiritual principle to the densest material form, is an expression of this divine mind in varying degrees of manifestation. The stars, the elements, the human soul, and the deepest layer of consciousness are all, in this vision, different faces of the same underlying reality. From this central principle flows the doctrine of correspondence. What is above is like what is below, not because the universe is repeating itself mechanically, but because every level of existence reflects the same divine pattern in its own language. The soul reflects the cosmos reflects the divine mind, and the divine mind is not separate from the soul that seeks it. The seeker who goes deep enough into the nature of their own awareness will, the tradition suggests, encounter not simply themselves, but the pattern that generates all things. This is why the Hermetic tradition is so insistent on inner work. The outer world is a map, but the map is drawn in the soul. The path of Hermetic ascent moves through a process of purification, not purification in a moralistic sense alone, but in a deeper sense of progressive clarification, of the gradual releasing of attachments, illusions, and the layers of identity that bind the soul to the purely material world. The Hermetic texts describe the soul ascending through what they call the spheres, the layers of the cosmos associated with the planets, each sphere representing a different quality of consciousness that must be understood, integrated, and ultimately transcended. At each stage, the soul sheds something, not parts of itself, but distortions, veils, accumulated forms of forgetting. Until at last, the tradition suggests what remains is the soul in its original transparency, a clear mirror held up to the divine mind that created it. Alchemy, in the Hermetic tradition, is not primarily a physical science, though it did inspire centuries of genuine laboratory experimentation. At its symbolic core, alchemy is a map of inner transformation. The famous goal of the alchemist, transforming base metal into gold, is a metaphor for the transformation of the soul. The lead that must be refined is the unexamined, attachment-laden, materially identified consciousness. The gold that the process seeks is not wealth, but the original luminosity of the awakened soul. The alchemical laboratory is, in this reading, the interior life of the seeker, and the experiments performed there are practices of attention, reflection, purification, and inner recognition. Astrology, similarly, in the Hermetic understanding, is not simply a system for predicting the future of earthly affairs. It is a sacred language that describes the correspondence between the movements of the cosmos and the conditions of the soul. Each planetary sphere in Hermetic cosmology represents a different quality of mind, a different mode of being through which the soul passes on its descent into matter and its eventual return toward the source. To read the stars in this tradition is to read a kind of grammar of existence, to understand which principles are at work in the cosmos and, by correspondence, in the inner life of the human being who stands beneath them. Sacred language itself, the language of the Hermetic dialogues, with their layered imagery, paradox, and symbols that point beyond themselves, serves a specific function. It is not designed to convey information in the way that modern language conveys information. It is designed to initiate an experience in the reader. The words are arranged not to satisfy the analytical mind, but to work on something beneath it, something that the tradition believed recognized the patterns of divine reality, even when the surface mind could not yet articulate them. This is why Hermetic texts often feel simultaneously clear and elusive. They are written for a part of the reader that knows more than the reader currently believes. The hidden turn in Hermetic thought is this: the tradition is not primarily about acquiring knowledge. It is about recognizing what is already present. The divine mind is not something the seeker must travel great distances to find. It is not locked in a forbidden library or guarded by initiates who hold the only key. In the deepest reading of the Hermetic texts, the divine mind is the very awareness with which the seeker is already looking. The mystery is not elsewhere. The archive is not behind a locked door. The hidden wisdom of Hermes points, finally and inescapably, toward the one who is seeking it. This is the turn that surprised even many of Hermes's most devoted students across the centuries. They came looking for a system of cosmic knowledge, a precise map of the universe, and the soul's place within it. And the tradition gave them that map. But it also did something unexpected. It showed them that the cartographer and the territory were not separate. The mind mapping the cosmos and the cosmos being mapped were, at the deepest level, one movement. This is not a comfortable idea. It is not the kind of secret that makes the ego feel powerful. It is the kind of secret that transforms the ego's understanding of itself altogether. And that, the tradition suggests, is exactly the point. Across the centuries, people who encountered Hermetic thought with genuine seriousness did not simply gain a new intellectual framework. They were changed. Ancient Neoplatonist philosophers like Plotinus, though he maintained his own distinct tradition, moved in philosophical currents deeply shaped by Hermetic ideas about the soul's origin and return. Early Christian thinkers wrestled with Hermetic wisdom and could not simply dismiss it. Medieval Arab philosophers preserved and transmitted Hermetic texts when they might otherwise have been lost entirely. Renaissance figures like Giordano Bruno and Pico della Mirandola found in the Hermetic tradition a vision of the human being so elevated, so charged with divine potential, that it changed how they understood the entire project of human knowledge. What these seekers shared was a sense that the Hermetic encounter had done something to the way they experienced the relationship between themselves and the world. The inner and outer were no longer simply separate categories. The soul and the cosmos were no longer strangers to each other. There was, for those who allowed the teaching to reach them deeply enough, a new quality of attention, a new way of moving through experience that was quieter, more integrated, and more alive to the correspondences between things. The universe began to feel not like a mechanism operating independently of the soul, but like a living text in which the soul could recognize its own nature. Before the encounter with Hermetic wisdom, the soul lives in a kind of scattered condition. It moves through the world identifying with whatever is most immediately available: desire, fear, habit, opinion, the noise of the social world, the demands of material survival. It is not that this scattered soul is evil or broken. It is simply forgetful. It has forgotten what it is and where it came from. It takes the outer world at face value and the inner world as a private, somewhat mysterious phenomenon with no obvious connection to the larger order of things. This is the condition that the Hermetic tradition names, not with contempt, but with a kind of compassionate precision, as sleep or ignorance or the darkness before the light finds its way in. After the encounter, something shifts. Not all at once. The Hermetic path is not a shortcut, but a gradual deepening. But the soul that has genuinely received the Hermetic teaching begins to perceive itself differently. It begins to notice the patterns, not in a superstitious sense, but in the sense of a growing awareness that the inner and outer worlds are in constant conversation, that the structure of thought reflects the structure of the cosmos, and that beneath the noise of ordinary experience there is a silence that is not empty, but full of the same divine order that the stars move through. The awakened soul in this tradition does not feel larger than the world. It feels continuous with it. The transformation that Hermetic thought aims at is not the transformation from a lesser person into a greater one. It is the transformation from a soul that does not recognize itself into a soul that does. And that recognition, the tradition insists, changes everything. Not because it grants power or privilege, but because it resolves the deepest form of loneliness. The loneliness of a soul that has forgotten its origin and therefore cannot understand why nothing in the outer world, no matter how beautiful or successful or satisfying, quite fills the space that was left by that forgetting. The Hermetic answer to that loneliness is not a doctrine to believe. It is an experience to undergo. The modern world is extraordinarily rich in information and extraordinarily poor in the experience of meaning. We have more access to more knowledge than any previous civilization in recorded history. And yet the hunger that drove people toward mystery schools in ancient Alexandria has not been satisfied. If anything, it has intensified. People feel scattered, fragmented, disconnected from any sense of cosmic belonging. The relationship between the individual soul and the larger order of things feels uncertain, contested, and sometimes entirely absent. This is precisely the wound that Hermetic thought was designed to address, not through the provision of more information, but through the invitation to perceive the pattern already present, the language of correspondence, of the inner life reflecting the outer cosmos, of the soul as a living mirror of the divine mind, speaks to something in modern experience that contemporary psychology, neuroscience, and even most mainstream religion do not quite reach. It speaks to the intuition, felt but rarely articulated, that the personal and the cosmic are not as separate as we have been told, that the condition of the soul and the condition of the world are not unrelated phenomena, that the inner work of purification, attention, and awakening is not an escape from the world, but a deeper engagement with its hidden order. This is why Hermetic thought continues to find new readers in every generation. It speaks to a hunger that does not age. The Hermetic texts did not survive in an unbroken line of transmission. Their history is itself a story of loss, preservation, recovery, and reinterpretation, a story that mirrors, in an almost uncanny way, the Hermetic teaching about descent and return. Many texts were lost as the ancient world collapsed. Others were preserved in Arabic translations made during the early Islamic period, held in libraries that were themselves eventually endangered until European translators recovered them centuries later. Then, in 1463, a Florentine monk brought to Cosimo de' Medici a manuscript containing the Corpus Hermeticum, and Marsilio Ficino was commissioned to translate it into Latin. This translation ignited the Renaissance imagination in ways that scholars are still attempting to fully understand. The influence of Hermetic thought spread through Renaissance painting, architecture, natural philosophy, and the beginnings of what would become modern science. Figures like Isaac Newton studied alchemical texts with the same seriousness they brought to mathematics. Robert Fludd created elaborate cosmological diagrams rooted in Hermetic principles. The Rosicrucian movement of the 17th century carried Hermetic symbolism into new forms of symbolic and fraternal tradition. Through Freemasonry, through the Western esoteric tradition, through the Theosophical movement, and eventually through depth psychology and certain streams of modern spirituality, the ideas that first took shape in ancient Alexandria continued to circulate, to find new languages, and to speak to new generations of seekers who felt the same hunger that had always driven people toward the archive of Hermes. Hermes Trismegistus stands at the intersection of more worlds than any single name should be able to hold. He is Egyptian and Greek, ancient and timeless, historical and mythological, human and divine. He is the scribe of the gods and the guide of souls, the keeper of the threshold between the visible and invisible worlds. And the wisdom attributed to him is not a collection of facts about the universe. It is a set of invitations to perceive the correspondence between the soul and the cosmos, to understand the inner life as a sacred archive, to recognize the divine mind not as something distant and untouchable, but as the very awareness with which you are reading these words and asking these questions. The journey through the Hermetic archive is ultimately an emotional as much as an intellectual one. It is the journey of a soul that feels lost in a universe of surfaces and rediscovers, through the slow work of attention and inner turning, that the surface was never all there was. Beneath the noise, beneath the doctrine, beneath the accumulated weight of centuries of institutional religion and materialist culture, the tradition of Hermes points toward something that has never stopped being present. Something quiet, luminous, and patient. The divine pattern, waiting to be recognized in the very soul that was always searching for it from the outside. We began with a question. What if the hidden wisdom of Hermes was never meant to give power over the world, but to teach the soul how to recognize the divine pattern already moving through it? Having walked through the archive together, we can hear that question differently now, because the answer does not live in a manuscript, in a doctrine, or in a tradition. It lives in the quality of attention with which the seeker approaches the search itself. Is wisdom something you possess? Or is wisdom something you gradually become as the layers of forgetting fall away and the original light of the soul grows steadily more visible? The wisdom of Hermes Trismegistus does not end in a secret. It ends in a recognition. The divine pattern that the ancient texts describe with such care through the language of correspondence, ascent, divine mind, and cosmic harmony is not a pattern that exists somewhere beyond the reach of the human soul. It is the pattern of the soul itself, seen clearly. The archive that Hermes guards is not a library of hidden facts. It is the interior archive of the human being who has learned to read their own nature with the same reverence and attention they might bring to an ancient sacred text. The manuscript and the reader are, in the end, written in the same language. If this archive speaks to the part of you that still searches, the part that senses something moving beneath the surface of ordinary life, subscribe and return. Every manuscript we open here is another invitation to go deeper, not just into history, but into the hidden architecture of your own soul. The archive remains open. The sage fades, as all sages eventually do, into the silence from which he came. The manuscripts grow old, the ink fades, the libraries are scattered by fire and time, and yet the question that Hermes carried at the center of his teaching does not fade with him. It moves through the centuries the way light moves through a crack in an old stone wall, persistent, quiet, and patient beyond all measure. The correspondence between the soul and the cosmos, the divine mind beneath the visible world. The archive that no authority can seal, because it is written in the living structure of the human being. And so we close this manuscript not with an answer, but with the same doorway we found at the beginning. A universe where the visible world is only the outer skin of a hidden order. A soul that carries within itself the pattern it has been searching for. And a figure, neither man nor God, who stands at the threshold between them, pointing inward, pointing always inward toward the light that was never hidden anywhere but here.